In Lesson 1, I described everyday informal contracts like store purchases, parking agreements, and others that might only be documented by a receipt. If the receipt does not include the terms I said were necessary to form a contract, then how can these agreements be contracts? This lesson describes contracts that are not required to be written and signed, contracts that must be written and signed, and finally, electronic contracts that satisfy writing and signature requirements without the necessity of traditional handwritten or printed contracts. Most oral and unwritten contracts are enforceable. Under most state law, so-called statutes of frauds, a contract must be in writing and signed by the party against whom it is to be enforced only if it fits in one of these 6 categories. First, it's a contract for the sale of an interest in land, or 2, it's a contract that is to be performed later than 1 year from the date of its making, or 3, it is a contract to pay the debt of another person, or 4, it's a contract for the sale of goods for a price of $500 or more, or 5, it's a contract for the sale of non-goods personal property for a price of $5,000 or more. Goods are tangible, movable property, so non-goods personal property might be something like intellectual property. Or 6, it's a contract for a non-possessory security interest in personal property or fixtures. This is like collateral. The most difficult one of these categories to understand is the one that talks about a contract that is to be performed more than 1 year from the date of its making, because courts have interpreted this type of contract to include any contract that could be fully performed more than 1 year from the date of its making. So, for example, if John tells Bill, I will pay you back the money you've lent me when my car is sold. He's saying that's how he'll get the money to pay back Bill. But John doesn't say when he'll get that money, so he might not get the money to repay Bill and pay off his debt until more than 1 year from the time he makes this contract promise. Therefore, it must be written and signed by John in order to satisfy the statute of frauds requirement. Once we know that a contract must be written and signed because it fits in one of the 6 statute of frauds categories, the questions arise, well, what does written mean and what does signed mean? Well, the courts have been very liberal generally in judging what is a writing, and for the most part they say a writing is sufficient if it reasonably identifies the subject matter of the contract, if it identifies the parties to the contract, and if it states with reasonable certainty the essential terms of the contract promises, so that a court will know how to enforce a contract if there's a dispute about it. The court's approach to signatures says, well, a signature can be any symbol made or adopted with an intention to authenticate the writing as that of the signer. So it could just be a pair of initials, maybe just a first name or a last name. It doesn't have to be formal. Writings have been found to be sufficient by courts if they are on the back of an envelope. Signatures have been found to be sufficient by courts if they're signatures in crayon. Finally, even though a contract might not be required to be written and signed, these formalities can be very useful because they can be evidence or proof that a contract has been formed and proof of what the duties of performance are. So certainly if you have a contract for a substantial amount of money, you should have it written and signed just because it will make it easier to prove what each of the parties' duties are. When the internet became a popular way of doing business in the 1990s, businesses and consumers started making electronic contracts on websites, such as the click, I agree type of contract we've all done on websites, and also contracts by exchanges of emails. Well, this raised the question of whether those contracts were in writing and signed, like printed contracts could be, in order to satisfy the statute of frauds requirements. In 1999, Congress passed the Electronic Signatures in Global and National Commerce, or e-Sign Act, to answer that question, and this act made certain electronic contracts, if they were in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce, equivalent to printed contracts to satisfy statute of frauds writing and signature requirements. If you have an international contract, which I'll talk about in Lesson 4, you should be aware of e-sign and you should look at what the requirements are for those electronic contracts. But otherwise, e-sign was only intended to be a stopgap until states could pass their own versions of the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act statute or similar laws, which had their own qualifications for electronic contracts that were valid under the statute of frauds requirements. And all states now have passed those types of contracts affecting those types of statutes affecting most contracts, but not all contracts. There are some exceptions that must still be written and signed in the traditional print manner. What are those requirements of the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act to make an electronic writing or an electronic signature sufficient to satisfy the statute of frauds? Well, the UITA statutes describe the requirements very broadly. They only require an electronic writing to be an electronic record capable of retention by the recipient at the time of receipt, and they only require an electronic signature to be any sound, symbol, or process attached to or logically associated with a contract or other record and executed or adopted by a person with the intent to sign the record. This is intentionally broad and flexible because the legislators did not want to restrict electronic writings or electronic signatures to one particular type of technology that existed when they passed this law. They knew that technology changed very quickly and in unforeseeable ways, so they wrote these definitions broadly so that future technologies could satisfy the requirements for electronic writings and electronic signatures if they serve the functions of electronic writings and electronic signatures. So these definitions focused on the function of a writing and the function of a signature rather than a specific technology. Finally, UITA has default rules for the time and place of sending and receipt of electronic contract communications. Default rules meaning they're the ones that apply unless the parties themselves set their own rules. And knowing the time and place of sending and receipt of an electronic contract communication can be important for determining what is the contract offer, what is the contract acceptance, when is the offer made, when is the acceptance made, for those rules I discussed in Lesson 1. UITA also has rules governing mistakes and errors in electronic contract formation that can be important for the subject of the next lesson, contract breaches, defenses, and enforcement. And finally, UITA allows electronic contract formation by automated software programs or so-called electronic agents, which includes those I agree contracts, also called click wrap contracts, that we all click on when we go or join a new website. What is an example of an email contract? Well, an email contract could be very simple in appearance. It would look just like a regular email. The date is there, and it would say who the contract is sent to, who it is sent from, what the subject matter is, and then it would say something like, I will do such and such, and you will do such and such. These are the contract promises, and perhaps there would be a name signed at the end. So the name would be the signature. The body of the email would include the contract promises, and if they satisfy the requirements I talked about in Lesson 1 to form a contract, here you have an email electronic contract. These are the chapters in my book, Everyone's Guide to Electronic Contracts, that relate to these rules. Thank you.